Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter. My husband said it standing at the head of a rented banquet table, glass raised, 22 guests watching, at the graduation dinner for the girl I had raised, fed, disciplined, comforted through nightmares, and loved as unmistakably my own for 18 years. He said it like a toast. He said it smiling. I didn't put my glass down. I didn't cry. But here's what Desmond Foster didn't know. Standing there so pleased with the cruelty he'd just wrapped in the shape of a compliment. The 18-year-old across the table, still in her cap and gown, was about to stand up in front of every single person in that room and tell her father exactly what he'd actually built, and what he'd just destroyed with one sentence. If you're new here, this is Silent Revenge. Before we get into this one, hit subscribe, because what Sophie said next is the reason I'm telling this story at all, and you don't want to miss where these stories go next. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Renata Foster, United States Army. I'm 49 years old, and I've spent 26 years in uniform, the last 11 of them as a logistics officer, overseeing supply chain operations across multiple deployments, work that requires the kind of unglamorous, exacting precision most people never think about until a convoy doesn't arrive where it's supposed to. Hold that professional identity in mind as I tell you the rest of this, because everything that happened in that banquet hall, 18 years in the making, eventually came down to precisely the kind of quiet, disciplined follow-through I'd built an entire career on. That career shaped the specific kind of parent I became, more than I fully understood at the time. Logistics work in a deployed environment means anticipating problems before they happen, building redundancy into every plan, because the cost of failure is measured in real consequences for real people relying on you. I brought that exact instinct home with me, every single time, applying it to Sophie's care with the same rigor, planning ahead for her needs during deployments, building support systems around her so that my absence, when it happened, never once meant her needs went unmet. Looking back, the discipline the Army demanded of me professionally became, almost without my choosing it, the exact discipline that let me raise a child under genuinely difficult circumstances with the kind of consistency she deserved. I met Desmond Foster 20 years ago, 3 years into my own military career, at a mutual friend's barbecue during a brief stateside rotation. He was a civilian, an accountant at a mid-sized firm, steady and unremarkable in the specific way that felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of stability a woman building an unpredictable military career might want in a partner. We married 18 months later. Our early marriage functioned reasonably well despite the strain any military marriage carries. Long separations during deployments, the particular loneliness of a spouse left managing a household alone for months at a stretch, the adjustment period every homecoming requires. The early years were genuinely warm, in ways that made the eventual fracture between us feel almost impossible to reconcile with how we'd started. Desmond used to write me actual letters during my early deployments, before the era of easy video calls, long, thoughtful pages describing ordinary things about his week specifically because he understood, correctly, that ordinary details were what I missed most, while surrounded by the extraordinary demands of an active deployment. I kept every one of those letters for years, in a small box in our closet, though I eventually threw them out, several years after the graduation dinner, once I understood I no longer needed them as evidence of a version of him I'd been hoping, for 2 decades, might fully return. 2 years into our marriage, we began trying to have children, and after 18 months of difficulty, I underwent testing that revealed a service-related complication. A pelvic injury sustained during a training exercise years earlier had caused scarring extensive enough that natural conception was, according to 2 separate specialists, extremely unlikely. That diagnosis reshaped something in me I never fully got back. I grieved it privately and completely, the specific grief of losing a future I'd quietly assumed would simply happen once the timing was right. And Desmond, in those early months, was genuinely supportive, gentle, in ways that reinforced my belief that I'd married someone who'd weather this particular disappointment alongside me, rather than let it fracture us. People who haven't lived through infertility rarely understand how it reshapes ordinary life. It isn't a single, contained sorrow you process and move past. It's a low, persistent ache that resurfaces at baby showers, at other people's pregnancy announcements, at the pediatrician's office waiting room you pass on the way to your own unrelated appointment. We explored IVF briefly, in those early years, but my specific scarring made even assisted conception a poor prospect, according to our fertility specialist. And eventually, exhausted by repeated disappointment, we let the conversation about biological children quietly stop, without either of us fully processing what that closure actually meant for the shape of the family we'd once assumed we'd build. I deployed 8 months later, a scheduled rotation I couldn't defer, 12 months overseas, coordinating logistics for a brigade combat team, the kind of demanding, all-consuming deployment that leaves very little room for anything beyond the mission at hand. I trusted Desmond completely during that deployment, the way you trust a spouse you've built 6 years of marriage with, never once suspecting that trust was being tested in ways I couldn't see from 8,000 miles away. I found out about the affair 3 months after returning. Desmond came to me directly, which I've come to understand, looking back, took a specific kind of desperate courage rather than any real integrity. He told me that during my deployment, he'd had a brief relationship with a woman named Camille Hensley, a co-worker at his firm, and that Camille had recently given birth to a daughter who was, based on timing and a paternity test Desmond had quietly arranged, unmistakably his. Here's the part of this story people find hardest to understand from the outside. Camille had never wanted the pregnancy in the first place, had struggled with the decision throughout, and in the weeks after the birth, had made clear to Desmond that she did not intend to raise the child herself, planning instead to place the baby for adoption through a private agency unless Desmond was prepared to take full custody immediately. Desmond came to me with an infant already in a bassinet in our guest room, having made the decision, entirely on his own, to accept custody before ever telling me any of this existed. The several days that followed were among the most difficult of my entire life. I was furious, devastated, betrayed in a way that went beyond the affair itself into a deeper, more complicated territory. The specific cruelty of my own infertility colliding directly with proof of Desmond's fertility with someone else, an infant now sleeping in my own house as the physical evidence of it. Why I ultimately chose to stay and to raise that child wasn't the simple, uncomplicated act of forgiveness some people assume from the outside. I spent 4 days in a hotel room, alone, working through what I actually wanted, and leaving felt, for most of those 4 days, like the only response that made sense. Those 4 days shaped the rest of my life more than almost any decision I've made since. The first day, I was simply, purely furious, unable to think clearly past the betrayal itself. The second day, the anger settled into something heavier, a grief that folded my own infertility diagnosis, together with the fact of an infant, biologically Desmond's, sleeping in a bassinet in the house I still technically shared with him, a specific, cruel irony I didn't know how to fully process. The third day, I called my own mother, a woman who'd weathered her own difficult marriage decades earlier, and asked her, plainly, whether staying would make me weak or foolish. She told me something I've carried since. There's a difference between staying because you're afraid to leave and staying because you've genuinely weighed what matters most and chosen it deliberately. Only you can tell which one this actually is. Don't let anyone else, including me, answer that question for you. What ultimately changed my calculation wasn't forgiveness for Desmond, not really. It was a phone call from Camille herself, on the third day, tracked down through Desmond with my reluctant permission, a woman I'd never met, crying, telling me that she'd made her decision about the adoption agency final, that the baby would go to strangers within the week if Desmond and I didn't formally commit to raising her ourselves. I sat with that phone call for a long time. I thought about the years of grief I'd already carried over my own infertility, the specific ache of watching other people's children grow up, while mine remained a medical impossibility. I thought about an infant who had done absolutely nothing to deserve becoming collateral damage in her parents' failures, about to be handed to strangers through an agency because nobody in the room where her fate was being decided actually wanted the inconvenience of raising her. Some part of my decision was genuinely about the baby herself, made independent of whatever I still felt about Desmond in that moment. I called him back on the 4th day and told him I would stay, and that I would raise this child as my own, fully, completely, with my name on her adoption paperwork alongside his, on one condition, that Camille would have no ongoing role in the child's life, that this would be, from that point forward, entirely and permanently my daughter, in every sense that actually mattered, not simply a biological technicality I was agreeing to tolerate. Camille agreed without hesitation, relieved, I think, to have the decision fully out of her hands, and she signed away her parental rights within the month, moving out of state shortly afterward. I never spoke with her again, though I understand she passed away 9 years later, from causes I never fully learned, a fact Sophie herself discovered independently much later, and chose, largely, not to dwell on. 18 years of genuine, complicated, real motherhood happened in between that phone call and the banquet hall, and reducing it to a single betrayal narrative would dishonor everything that actually built our relationship. I formally adopted her at 4 months old, and from that point forward, she was, in every practical and emotional sense, entirely my daughter. I caught her first steps during a rare stretch of stateside duty. I sat up with her through every childhood fever, every nightmare, every scraped knee. I coached her through a genuinely difficult stretch in middle school when other kids discovered, through some family gossip that traveled further than it should have, that she wasn't biologically mine, and I remember, specifically, sitting with her on her bed while she cried, telling her that biology was the least interesting thing about how a family actually gets built, that showing up, every single day, for 18 years, was the actual definition of a mother that mattered. A few more memories from those years matter to understanding the actual depth of what Sophie later defended at that banquet table. When she was 7, she developed a severe case of pneumonia that required a 5-day hospital stay, and I was scheduled for a training rotation that overlapped with the worst of it. I requested emergency leave instead, a genuinely consequential decision for an officer trying to advance in rank, and I never once regretted it, not for a single day since. When she was 11, she went through a stretch of severe anxiety about an upcoming deployment of mine, and I spent every evening for 2 weeks beforehand recording short video messages, one for each day I'd be gone, so she'd have something of me to watch, even during the stretches when live communication wasn't possible. I still have copies of those recordings, and I know, because she's told me directly, that she still watches them occasionally, even now, at 18. My own relationship with Desmond never fully recovered from what happened, even as I committed fully to raising Sophie. We stayed married, technically, for the next 18 years, but something essential had fractured permanently, and we built, over those years, less a genuine partnership and more a careful, functional coexistence, organized primarily around raising Sophie well, despite the wound at the center of how she'd come to exist. I deployed twice more over those years, each time trusting Desmond with Sophie's daily care in a way that required a specific, deliberate act of professional compartmentalization, separating the mother in me who trusted him with our daughter from the wife in me who had never fully forgiven him. If you're still with me, this is where everything I just described collides. Stay subscribed, because what happens at that graduation dinner is the whole reason this story exists, and it happens faster than you'd expect. Desmond loved Sophie, genuinely, I believe, in his own limited way, but underneath that love he carried a persistent, unexamined guilt about the circumstances of her birth that he never once processed in any healthy way, through therapy or honest conversation, choosing instead to simply avoid thinking about it directly for years at a stretch. That avoidance worked, more or less, until stress or alcohol lowered his guard, at which point I noticed, across the years, an occasional dark, bitter humor would surface. Small comments, delivered as jokes, that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of self-loathing projected outward onto the situation itself, sometimes landing, in ways he probably didn't fully register, as cruelty toward Sophie or toward me. One specific incident, 4 years before the graduation, foreshadowed exactly what would eventually happen in that banquet hall. At Sophie's 14th birthday party, Desmond, several drinks into the evening, made a comment to his brother, within earshot of several of Sophie's friends, about how, "We almost gave this one away. You know, worked out all right in the end." I remember the specific look on her face, 14 years old, hearing her own father joke about nearly being given away for adoption in front of her friends. I pulled Desmond aside afterward, furious, and told him plainly that whatever unprocessed guilt he carried about her origins was his to manage privately, in therapy, in honest reflection, never again as a joke delivered at his own daughter's expense. That confrontation established a pattern that repeated, in smaller ways, over the following years. Desmond, cornered in our kitchen that night, didn't initially understand why I was so furious, genuinely confused about why a joke he considered harmless had landed as cruelty. "It's not like I said anything that isn't true," he told me. I explained, as plainly as I could manage through my own anger, that truth and cruelty aren't opposites, that a fact delivered without care for who's absorbing it can do just as much damage as an outright lie, sometimes more, because the person hearing it can't even dismiss it as untrue. He apologized that night, genuinely enough that I believed, for a while, the pattern might actually stop. I called my closest friend from officer training, a fellow logistics officer named Deja Whitlock, who'd become something like an aunt to Sophie over the years, the day after that 14th birthday incident. She told me something that stuck with me for the following 4 years. "You're going to have to decide, eventually, whether this is a pattern he's capable of breaking or a pattern you're just going to keep managing indefinitely," she said. "I've watched you manage a lot of hard things with a lot of grace over the years, Renata. I just don't want managing Desmond's guilt to become one more thing you carry so he doesn't have to." It didn't stop. It simply went quiet for a few years, the way patterns do right before they resurface with considerably more force. Sophie's graduation, this past June, should have been an unambiguously joyful day. She'd earned it entirely on her own merit. Valedictorian of her class, a full academic scholarship to a competitive engineering program. The kind of achievement that should have made any parent, biological or otherwise, unreservedly proud. We hosted a dinner that evening at a banquet hall we'd rented for the occasion. 22 guests, extended family, a handful of Sophie's closest friends, a celebration I'd spent weeks planning with genuine excitement. Desmond had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, more than I'd seen him drink in years, and I noticed it building, that specific loosening quality that had preceded every one of his worst comments over 18 years. I'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the significance of the occasion would keep whatever was building underneath contained. It didn't. Near the end of the meal, Desmond stood, tapped his glass for a toast, and the room quieted, expecting, reasonably, the kind of warm, proud speech any father might give at his daughter's graduation dinner. He started that way, actually, praising Sophie's academic achievements, her work ethic, the specific pride he felt watching her walk across that stage earlier that afternoon. And then, in a shift that landed like a physical blow, his voice took on the dark, bitter edge I recognized immediately from years of smaller incidents, and he turned toward me, glass raised, and said it. "Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter." The silence that followed wasn't a gasp, not immediately. It was a kind of collective, frozen incomprehension, 22 guests processing a sentence that didn't fit the celebratory register of everything that had come before it. Several of them clearly unsure, for a beat, whether they'd actually heard what they thought they'd heard. I didn't put my glass down. My first instinct, 26 years of military training surfacing automatically, was to maintain composure at all costs, to not give the room the spectacle of my own visible devastation on top of whatever Desmond had just detonated. I looked at him. What I saw on his face wasn't triumph exactly, but something closer to a man who'd finally said out loud a sentence he'd apparently been carrying, unprocessed, for 18 years, delivered with the specific relief of someone unburdening themselves without any real consideration for who else in the room would carry the weight of what he'd just set down. I looked across the table at Sophie. Her face in that moment is the image I return to most often when I think about that entire evening. She sat very still, still in her cap, the gold cords of her honors sash catching the banquet hall's dim lighting, and something moved across her expression that wasn't quite shock, because some part of her, I would learn shortly, had actually known the full truth of her origins for years. What moved across her face was something closer to a specific, quiet calculation, the particular stillness of someone deciding, in real time, exactly how she was going to respond to the worst thing her father had ever said to her. On the single day that should have belonged entirely to her, she stood up. 22 guests, still frozen from Desmond's toast, now watched an 18-year-old girl, still in her graduation regalia, rise slowly from her chair at the center of her own celebration dinner, and something in the quality of her posture, steady, deliberate, entirely unhurried, told everyone at that table that whatever came next deserved their complete attention. "I want to say something," Sophie said, and her voice carried none of the tremor you might expect from an 18-year-old confronting her father in front of extended family. It carried, instead, a specific, controlled clarity that I recognized, with a strange pride even in that devastating moment, as something she'd learned watching me handle difficult moments throughout her entire childhood. "I've known for 6 years that Renata isn't my biological mother," she said, looking directly at Desmond. "I found the adoption paperwork in the filing cabinet when I was 12, looking for my birth certificate for a school project. I read every page of it alone, in my room, and I never told either of you I'd found it, because I spent 6 years trying to figure out what it actually meant about who I was." The specific shock of learning she'd known for 6 years, information he'd apparently assumed remained safely hidden, visibly compounded the moment's disaster in real time on Desmond's face. "Here's what I figured out," Sophie continued, her eyes never leaving her father's face. "Biology tells you where you came from. It doesn't tell you who actually raised you. Renata deployed twice while I was growing up, and called me every single week she possibly could, sometimes at 3 in the morning her time, just to catch me before school. She sat up with me through pneumonia when I was 7, missed a training rotation she wasn't supposed to miss, because she wasn't going to leave me in that hospital room alone. She read every single college application essay I wrote, and told me, honestly, which paragraphs were actually good, and which ones I needed to rewrite. She's the one who taught me what it actually means to show up for someone, every single day, whether or not it's convenient, whether or not the circumstances that brought you together were something either of you chose." The room was completely silent now, every single guest fixed on the 18-year-old standing at the center of the table. "You just called her the woman who raised your mistress's daughter," Sophie said, her voice finally carrying an edge of real anger underneath the control. "I've spent 6 years watching you carry whatever guilt you have about how I came to exist, and I've spent 6 years watching you occasionally let that guilt turn into cruelty, usually toward her, sometimes toward me, always dressed up as some kind of joke you expect everyone to laugh along with. I'm not laughing tonight, Dad. I don't think anyone else at this table is laughing either." She paused, the room so silent you could hear the banquet hall's air conditioning cycling on somewhere overhead. "I want you to actually understand something," she continued, "because I don't think you've ever let yourself sit with it directly. You had a choice, 18 years ago, about how to carry what happened. You could have done the work, therapy, honesty, whatever it actually would have taken to process your own guilt like an adult. Instead, you let it curdle into something you occasionally aimed at the two people who had the least control over any of it. Me, who didn't choose to be born from an affair, and her, who chose, actively and repeatedly, to love me anyway, despite everything you put her through to make that choice possible." She turned to look directly at me, and what happened next undid the last of my carefully held composure entirely. "Renata," she said, "you are my mother, not my stepmother, not the woman who raised me despite everything, my actual mother, in every single way that word has ever meant anything to me. I don't care whose blood is in my veins. I care who sat up with me through every fever, who read every essay, who called from the other side of the world at 3 in the morning because she wasn't going to let a deployment cost her a single week of actually knowing me. That's not a technicality, Dad. That's the entire definition of what a parent is." I was crying by that point, quietly, the composure I'd maintained through Desmond's toast finally giving way entirely. Several guests were crying too. Desmond's own brother, sitting near the head of the table, looked at him with an expression of open, unmistakable disappointment. Nobody moved to smooth over the moment. Nobody rushed to change the subject or restore the celebratory mood artificially. The room simply sat with the weight of what Sophie had said, understanding, collectively, that it deserved to be sat with rather than rushed past. A few specific reactions from that room mattered to me more than I expected them to in the aftermath. My own mother, seated near the middle of the table, reached across and took my hand without saying anything, gripping it tightly through the rest of Sophie's speech. Desmond's mother, Sophie's biological grandmother in the strictest technical sense, sat with tears streaming silently down her face, and I learned later, from a brief, careful conversation the following week, that she'd never once considered Sophie anything other than fully her granddaughter either, and that watching her own son's cruelty land in that room had devastated her nearly as much as it devastated Sophie and me. One of Sophie's closest friends from high school, seated near the end of the table, later told her she'd been recording a portion of the toast on her phone for a graduation memory video before everything shifted, and had simply let the camera keep rolling once she understood what was actually unfolding, capturing, inadvertently, the entire exchange, though Sophie ultimately asked her to delete it rather than let it circulate further than the room it happened in. If you've made it this far, make sure you're subscribed. The aftermath of that night, and what happened between Desmond and Sophie in the months since, is honestly the part of this story I think about most. Desmond didn't say anything for a long moment, standing there at the head of the table, his earlier bitter satisfaction entirely drained from his face, replaced with something that looked, unmistakably, like a man finally confronting the actual weight of 18 years of unprocessed guilt in the worst possible setting, in front of everyone who mattered most. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, and finally sat down without finishing whatever he'd started to say. The first time in 18 years of marriage I'd ever seen him genuinely, completely at a loss for words. The story didn't end at that banquet hall. Its actual resolution took considerably longer and proved considerably more complicated than a single, satisfying speech at dinner. Desmond and I separated 3 weeks later, a decision that had, I think, been building for years beneath the surface of our careful, functional coexistence, finally given the push it needed by watching our daughter articulate, in front of 22 witnesses, exactly what 18 years of his unprocessed guilt had cost both of us. The separation wasn't primarily about the affair itself anymore, 18 years removed from that original betrayal. It was about watching him choose, repeatedly, across nearly 2 decades, to let his own private shame surface as cruelty, rather than ever doing the harder work of actually processing it in a way that protected the people around him from absorbing it. I called a military legal assistance attorney the week after the separation, working through the practical logistics of ending a 20-year marriage while managing an active duty career. One conversation with that attorney, a careful, thoughtful woman named Priya Anand, helped me understand something about the entire 18 years I hadn't fully articulated before. "You didn't stay in that marriage for Desmond," she told me, reviewing the timeline I'd laid out for her. "You stayed for Sophie, and you built an entire, genuine parent-child relationship on a foundation Desmond himself never fully participated in building alongside you. Whatever this divorce settlement looks like, the actual relationship you built with your daughter was never something that required his ongoing participation to remain real." Priya walked me through the practical realities of the divorce over several subsequent meetings. One detail mattered more to me than any of the financial logistics, confirming, formally, that my status as Sophie's legal adoptive parent carried exactly the same weight, in every relevant respect, as if I'd given birth to her myself, a fact I'd understood intuitively for 18 years, but found strangely necessary to hear stated plainly by a lawyer. "There's no asterisk on adoptive parenthood in the eyes of the law," Priya told me. "There shouldn't be one in your own understanding of it either, whatever your husband said at that dinner." Sophie and I had a real conversation a few days after that graduation dinner, once the immediate shock of the evening had settled into something we could actually discuss calmly. She told me, more fully than she had at the table, about discovering the adoption paperwork at 12, about the specific, private fear she'd carried for years that learning the truth might somehow change how she felt about our relationship, and about the relief she'd eventually found in realizing it hadn't changed anything at all. "I probably should have told you I knew," she said. "I think I was scared that saying it out loud would somehow make it more real, or make you worry I saw you differently. I didn't. I don't. I just needed time to figure that out for myself before I said anything." I told her I understood, and that I was proud of her, more than I could easily put into words, for the composure and clarity she'd shown at that dinner table. "I learned that from you," she told me. "Every single time you handled something hard without falling apart in front of me growing up, I was taking notes, even when I didn't realize it." I called Deja the morning after that graduation dinner, still processing everything that had happened. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, "I told you 4 years ago, you'd have to decide whether that pattern was breakable. I don't think either of us expected Sophie to be the one who finally forced the answer. She came over that weekend, and we sat together going through the whole evening in detail. You spent 18 years building the exact kind of daughter who could stand up in a room full of adults and say something true and necessary without flinching," she told me. "That's not an accident, Renata. That's the actual result of 18 years of exactly the kind of parenting you're now questioning whether you did well enough. You did it well enough. She just proved it in front of 22 witnesses. What happened with Desmond in the month since wasn't a clean, simple villain's ending, and the more complicated truth matters more, I think. He reached out to both Sophie and me, separately, about a month after the dinner, having started, on his own initiative, individual therapy specifically to work through the guilt he'd apparently carried, largely unexamined, for the better part of 2 decades. I don't know the full extent of what he's processed in that therapy. It's not something I need access to at this point in our relationship. But Sophie has told me, in the months since, that their relationship, while still genuinely strained, has become at least honest in a way it never was, during all the years he spent letting his guilt surface sideways as bitter jokes, instead of direct conversation. Sophie's own adjustment to college happened alongside the divorce and carried its own complicated weight. She started her engineering program 6 weeks after that graduation dinner, and I remember driving her to campus, both of us quieter than either of us expected to be, processing simultaneously the ordinary transition of a daughter leaving home and the extraordinary aftermath of everything that had happened at her own graduation celebration. She called me most weeks that first semester, sometimes just to talk about coursework, sometimes to process what had happened with her father, and around Thanksgiving she told me she'd decided, on her own, to keep a careful but genuine line of communication open with Desmond going forward. I don't think what he did was okay, she told me. I also don't think cutting him off entirely teaches me anything except how to run from hard things. I'd rather learn how to hold both, that he hurt me badly, and that people can sometimes actually change if they do the real work. I told her I was proud of that clarity. At 18, more than she probably understood. I've rebuilt my own life carefully since the divorce finalized, staying in the same house Sophie grew up in, close enough to her college campus that she comes home most weekends during her first year. I received a promotion to full colonel about 4 months after the divorce. Work that had been building toward for years finally recognized around the same time my personal life was undergoing its own significant reckoning, and I've found, in the months since, a specific kind of settled clarity about the entire 18 years that preceded that graduation dinner. Grief, still, for the marriage that never fully recovered from what happened in its early years, but genuine, uncomplicated pride in the daughter that marriage, however imperfectly, produced. The last conversation I had with Desmond, about 6 weeks after the divorce finalized, closes this story more honestly than a simple villain's comeuppance would. He called to ask whether I thought Sophie would eventually forgive him fully. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that forgiveness wasn't something I could promise on her behalf, and that the more useful question was whether he was doing the actual work to become someone worth forgiving, regardless of the eventual outcome. I spent 18 years letting shame turn into cruelty instead of doing the harder thing, he said quietly. I don't know how to undo that. I think I just have to keep showing up honestly and see what happens. I told him that was, as far as I understood it, the only path that had ever actually worked for anyone, in any relationship, and that I hoped, for Sophie's sake more than my own at this point, that he'd actually follow through on it. That banquet hall stays with me. The exact moment Desmond decided a graduation toast was the appropriate venue for 18 years of unprocessed guilt, and the exact moment our daughter stood up and refused to let his cruelty define either of us. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never once needed to defend myself in that room. 18 years of actually showing up, every single day, had already built a case Sophie herself was fully equipped to make, more clearly and more powerfully than I ever could have made it on my own behalf. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about how rarely the truth arrives in such a clean, complete way, delivered by exactly the person who needed to say it, in exactly the room that needed to hear it. Not every story like this gets a graduation dinner and a daughter equipped, through years of careful, honest parenting, to stand up and articulate the truth so clearly. More often, this kind of vindication happens slowly, in smaller, less dramatic moments, over years rather than in a single decisive evening, and I feel a specific kind of humility about how fortunate I was that Sophie had both the courage and the clarity to say what she said, at 18, in front of that many witnesses. Not every parent gets that gift, and I don't take it for granted. I turned 50 this past month, and Sophie came home for the occasion, along with Deja and a handful of close friends. Blowing out the candles, I found myself thinking about the version of myself who sat in that hotel room 18 years earlier, deciding whether to stay and raise a child who wasn't biologically mine. I don't know if that version of me could have imagined this exact outcome: a full colonel's rank, a daughter thriving in college, a marriage that ended but a motherhood that never once wavered. I think she'd be proud, mostly, that the decision she made in that hotel room, driven as much by compassion for an infant who'd done nothing wrong as by anything else, turned out to matter as much as it did, 18 years later, in a banquet hall neither of us could have possibly anticipated. If you've ever had someone try to reduce years of genuine devotion to a single ugly technicality, remember this: the people who actually witnessed what you built, day after day, year after year, are often the ones best equipped to defend it. And sometimes the truth needs nothing more than the room finally being ready to hear it spoken plainly. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what your own family got wrong about what real love actually looks like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Silent Revenge. New stories about the quiet people who finally get to be seen exactly as they are go up every week, and I genuinely don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.